in making the introductions, I have to read from this text, which is so small that I can't read anymore. So I have to borrow his glasses. Please forgive me for this. So the first speaker is Brian Launder. He told me how not to introduce him, but and I will try to obey his dictum. Brian Launder obtained his doctorate from the gas turbine lab at MIT for experimental research on laminarization of turbulent boundary layers before joining Imperial College, where he worked for 12 years, helping to develop much of the early definitive work on turbulence modeling. After a 4-year spell at UC Davis, he returned to the UK in 1980 to head the thermofluids division of UMIST. His group in Manchester has developed an international reputation in the development and application of turbulence modeling strategies for a wide range of engineering phenomena and problems. His achievements have been recognized by his admission to the UK's Royal Academy of Engineering and the Royal Society, and by the conferment of honorary doctorates by 3 European universities all over. In summer 2011, CUP will publish the book Turbulence Modeling for Engineering and the Environment, co-authored with his first PhD student and friend of more than 40 years, Professor Hanyalit. Now, there is no better person to speak about Osborne Reynolds than Brian, for a number of reasons. One of them being that he continues to work in the same place. Brian. Can I keep it for a while? Your while. Forward and backwards.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Real pleasure to be here. I'd like to first say a thank you to the editors of the volume, A Voyage Through Turbulence, for the invitation extended to Derek Jackson and myself to contribute our thoughts, our ideas on setting Osborne Reynolds at the beginning of this book. Articles on Osborne Reynolds have been appearing, well, from the time of his death. 2 extensive obituaries appeared, and there have been 100-page long articles on him appearing, at least half a dozen. And Derek and I, in fact, provided an article for annual reviews in fluid mechanics in 2007. For a while, we'd been wanting to write a different type of account on Osborne Reynolds that really featured on the person rather than his work, or principally on the person in order to provide his groundbreaking discoveries and publications, to provide a context within which to see his life as a whole. And we're very grateful to the editors for allowing us that freedom. It means, however, that I've got to provide a little bit of background. Where did Osborne Reynolds come from? Did he emerge from the slums? No, he didn't. His family were a very well-established landowning family from a small village in Suffolk called Debauch. They owned some 500 acres of land there, and beginning with Osborne Reynolds' great-grandfather, they had a succession, they provided a succession of rectors of the local parish church. Both his grandfather and great-grandfather, as I indicated, were rectors, and it seemed probable that his father, who unfortunately was also called Osborne, he seemed destined to follow that family tradition. I'll call him the Reverend Osborne Reynolds, just so there's no possible distinction. He went to Queen's College, Cambridge to study mathematics, graduating with high honours, and shortly thereafter he was ordained a priest. He married a 22-year-old widow, someone called Jane Breyer, and their only daughter, Jane, was born in 1840. It seemed probable that he wanted to get into the church, but I suspect it was as a matter of a holding operation, waiting until a suitable opportunity arose, that in fact in 1841 he moved with his young family to Belfast in Ireland to become headmaster of the first collegiate school there. It was there that Osborne Reynolds was born. Date will be known to many of you, and however, this is what makes me think it was a holding operation. He was only there a couple of years, and then he returned to England, where he became curate at a church in Buckinghamshire. So it seemed that the Reverend Osborne Reynolds was destined for a career in the church. Only by a sad act of fate, his wife died in giving birth to their second son, Edward. So in 1844, the Reverend Osborne Reynolds found himself with family to support, and I suspect it was that led him to think, well, I've been a headmaster once, let's see what we can do. And he secured the position as headmaster of Dedham Grammar School in Essex. Here I'd mention that my lecture is departing from the text. Maybe some of you are even flipping the pages to see where these pictures occur. The editors had a preference for people over buildings, and at their request, I've obliterated almost all of the buildings that appeared in the original version submitted to them. I see this opportunity of the oral presentation today, unexpected as it was, as being a possibility for reinserting the buildings without too much offense being given to the editors. Anyway, here we see two views of the school that Osborne Reynolds, the Reverend Osborne Reynolds, took over the headmastership of. The one on the left is a 19th century inkwash painting of the school. One on the right is a photograph I took about 18 months ago, I suppose. It's still there, looking very much the same. Alas, its function has changed. It's now been chopped up into various twee flats for the middle class. Well, the Reverend Osborne Reynolds stayed there for some time. His father died in 1848, but because the school was only some 25 miles from Dedham, where his father had been the rector, his early inclination to work in the church got the better of him, and every Sunday he would trip off. Probably he needed to leave maybe Friday evening, because there weren't fast bus services in those days. Anyway, for 2 years he discharged the job of being rector as well as being headmaster. But then, strange, a further catastrophe hit him. His 10-year-old daughter died, and I guess at that point with his father's affairs being settled, he decided that he'd return to the family seat, resigned his job as headmaster. One account, actually, that we found suggested that he was forced to resign, but that's unconfirmed. Anyway, he returned to take over the family seat. Here we see the home he moved to in Dedham. But alas, in the farming crisis of 1879, he decided, well, the farm basically went bankrupt, everything was sold, and he became a vicar again at the age of 66 and continued that way until he retired at 75. Osborne Reynolds, the Reverend Osborne Reynolds, had a lifelong interest in practical problems. He took out some 7 or 8 patents during his lifetime, didn't make much money, if anything, from them, and he also devoted himself to the education of his 2 sons. So let's turn then to Osborne Reynolds, who's the main focus of today's talk. As you heard, he was born in Ireland, but returned to England within a year. That certainly doesn't prevent many historical websites in Ireland from claiming Osborne Reynolds as an Irishman. Anyway, but I could find none that claimed him to be an Englishman with the same patriotic fervor, at any rate. It's not the English style, perhaps. As you've also already heard, his mother had died early, and his father provided his early training, and after that was complete, he was sent off effectively to be an apprentice. Well, an apprentice was the general term used, but this was a very special type of apprenticeship where Edward Hayes made a good part of his earnings from educating the wealthy. Don't bother with the poor, because he managed in those days to charge fees of £300 per year to instruct each apprentice. Why did he go there? You can see the quote from a letter written by Edward Hayes sometime later. He went there to learn in the shortest possible time how work should be done, and as far as time would admit, to be made a working mechanic before going to Cambridge to work for honours. Here's one of the posters displaying the Edward Hayes firm from the period. So indeed, Osborne Reynolds in 1863 did go to Queen's like his father. He graduated rather higher up on the list of first-class honours graduates than his father did, 7th Wrangler, implying that he was the 7th in line. And on graduation, he went to work for a firm of civil engineers in London, Lawson and Mansard. Made a good entry, but in less than a year, the chair of engineering was announced at Owens College, Manchester. Initially, the chair was advertised at £250 per annum. It brought 18 applications, including that of Osborne Reynolds. But the popular magazine Engineering, as soon as the advertisement had appeared, wrote a very caustic, sardonic article suggesting that this was a totally derisory sum. The initiative to establish a chair of engineering was welcomed, but the amount, £250 per year, was only 1/4 of that was paid to an assistant master at Eton College. Thereupon, the committee of trustees, who had themselves got together enough money to found the chair, met again, and there was a wealthy German who had left Germany at the age of 18 to come to England to make his fortune, and indeed he had done just that. He was so enthusiastic that he offered to put up an additional £250 for the first 5 years to obtain applications. Well, the purpose of putting up this extra money was to attract big names. And it looked as though Professor Rankin, famous for the Rankin cycle, from Glasgow University, could be tempted to apply. But finally he said, "Oh, what the hell, no thanks." So in the end, there seemed to be three principal candidates. The first I'd mention is William Cawthorne Unwin. Why would I mention him? Well, the chairman of the industrial committee that had organized the money had promised this candidate very strong support. Unwin had worked with Fairbairn, had greatly impressed him, and, well, Fairbairn wasn't on the selection committee, but as chairman of the committee that got the money together, I guess one could feel that he'd expect to have pretty strong influence. However, Unwin was finally not interviewed. I mention him, however, because he'll crop up a bit later in the talk. The final candidates were George Fuller, more mature in age than Unwin. He'd graduated from King's College and actually gone to work with an engineering firm. In today's parlance, we call it a spin-off company from Queen's University in Belfast, where Calvin's brother, James Thompson, was a professor, but he also had a company on the side, and Fuller went to work with him. Fuller had acquired a good deal of further experience. However, he too was unsuccessful. As you'll see from the slide, he later had a very successful academic career. But it was left to Osborne Reynolds, 25, of just less than a year's post-university experience, who triumphed on the day. There were a dozen letters of support, one from his father, and we can see here, I hope it's probably, I don't know, can you read that? Those in the front can. It basically says that the meeting of the trustees on the 26th day of March, 1868, resolved that, and then he goes on to say, Osborne Reynolds be appointed Professor of Civil and Mechanical Engineering in Owens College, and goes on to say, at the yearly salary of £300 and a proportion of fees from the students. And then later on it says that the trustees guaranteeing to Mr. Reynolds that the total amount of his stipend for the first 5 years, or until the prior determination, meaning termination, of his engagement as a professor, be not less than £500 per annum. So, Osborne Reynolds came to Manchester, and it was a tumultuous beginning. He was asked to give the opening address to the university as a new professor, and in the same year he married Charlotte Chadwick. However, almost immediately his wife died. He died following the birth of their only son. So Reynolds, at the start of his career, not only had to organize everything, but had to take responsibility for the family and so on. One has to acknowledge that in those days, university salaries were at a sufficient level that one could afford live-in domestic help. Where was it he taught? And this photograph is in the article. It was, here's a picture of Owens College as it was at the time. J.J. Thompson was a briefly a pupil at the school. He started there at the age of 14. In a year or so, he'd had enough of that and went off to Cambridge to get his formal degrees. But in his memoirs, he wrote very warmly of his time in Manchester, of Osborne Reynolds, and also the fact that the teaching was located in the stables at the back of this building, and that the only laboratory and drawing office for students was in the hayloft above, what had been the hayloft above. Well, that building still exists, and here we see the modern version of it. It's now solicitors' offices. Those of you that are familiar with the style in Britain of putting up circular plaques to mark out distinguished people will notice that there is one at the front of the building. Alas, it does not commemorate Osborne Reynolds. It celebrates a local politician who lived there before Reynolds. So, in the first decade, Reynolds had no labs at all, and he really focused on what J.J. Thompson termed out-of-doors physics, writing papers on the tails of comets, the solar corona, electrical properties of clouds, but then little by little his attention shifted to fluids. One of his early papers was on the bursting of tree trunks struck by lightning, which he attributed to the vaporization of the sap, causing such an expansion that it split the trunk open. He also did work on calming seas, both by spreading oil and by rainwater hitting the surface, and other matters of that kind. He looked at surface waves in deep water, and really then the first paper that especially focuses on our current interests was one on what today we call Reynolds analogy. Let me just quote from a little bit from the paper. He talks of the natural diffusion of the fluid. He's saying that heat transfer is caused by two mechanisms: the natural diffusion of the fluid, what we would call molecular transport, and secondly, it is caused by the visible motion which mixes the fluid up and continually brings fresh particles into contact with the surface. The second arises entirely from the motion of the fluid and is proportional to the density and the velocity of the fluid motion. Well, as a result of 10 years sustained activity, he was admitted a Fellow of the Royal Society. We come to the second decade, and that is a good deal more of a roller coaster. In 1879, his son, who had been sickly for some time, died. 2 years later, he married Annie Charlotte, who was daughter of the parish adjacent to the one where Osborne Reynolds' father had been rector. So clearly that provided the connection between the families. They continued to occupy a house at 23 Ladybarn Lane in Fallowfield, which is just a couple of miles north of the campus. Here I took a photo of that. It's a relatively modest house. It has 6 or 7 bedrooms. The garden is clearly overgrown now. Why? Because it's been divided up into student flats, and students in England, at any rate, don't go out and trim the hedges and mow the lawn at weekends. And in 1882, he was made an honorary fellow of Queen's College. Just try and give you a glimpse of his working life, and that is very well presented by a letter that his daughter wrote to another relative This was written much later, but I'm assuming that the pattern of life that it describes didn't change greatly over the years. Can you read that at the back, or should I read it out? You can read it. So that first sets out how he traveled. His daughter said sometimes she'd come out of town where she was going to school, come out of town by tram to join him, and so they walked home together, he with his stick or umbrella over his shoulder, and he never knew that she was there. And then after getting home, after reading the papers, by which I'm sure she meant the newspapers and not published scientific work before dinner, he then worked all the evening until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Every day the same, except Saturday afternoon and Sunday when he went for long walks with his friends. Have things changed? I can think of 1 or 2 people that work approximately in that way. Well, now we come, sorry if it's a bit belatedly, to the first turbulent flow paper. I'm sure you've seen this, this lithograph, this etching. It's not really an etching. I can't think of the technical term, but it's been reproduced hundreds of times in lectures and in textbooks. So let's see how the Osborne Reynolds apparatus looks today. Until this year, it was used by every undergraduate coming through the University of Manchester Mechanical Engineering stream. But we finally thought the class sizes have got so large, the poor old apparatus needs a bit of a rest, so we had a acrylic replica made, and this is used purely to demonstrate to visiting high-level academics like yourself, to show that it still does function in the way that Reynolds intended it to. Well, his paper then on flow, on the transition from laminar to turbulent flow was submitted to the Royal Society. It reported a wide range of experiments, both the flow visualization experiments that were demonstrated here, but also flow through industrial pipes of many, many different diameters, where he simply measured the pressure drop once the flow had become fully developed. The paper duly went to referees. So the issue was, what on earth would they say about it? Quite distinguished referees. One of them was Lord Rayleigh, and you may find the handwriting a little difficult to interpret. Let me read it out. On March the 30th, 1883, Rayleigh writes, "This paper records some well-contrived experiments on a subject which has long needed investigation, the transition between the laws of flowing capillary tubes and in tubes of large diameters as employed in engineering. I am of opinion that the results are important and that the paper should be published in the Phil Trans." The second referee was Sir George Stokes, who made something of a reputation for himself by pioneering the use of the typewriter. Clearly, however, typing was sufficiently arduous that whenever he made a mistake, he would cross it out by hand. This is just the opening paragraph of the letter. Later on, as he got tired, he made more and more mistakes. His proofreading wasn't that good, because in the penultimate line, you'll see that the word chass, C-H-A-S-S, should really be class. One class of, he shows also that one class of motion passes into the other with an unexpected suddenness, something that Julian was talking about last night in his lecture. Well, on the basis of this, the paper was accepted. However, Lord Rayleigh had not a sting, but certainly a note of encouragement that rounded off his review. He said, in several places, The paper refers to theoretical investigations whose nature is not sufficiently indicated. That perhaps provided a target for future work. Immediately following that paper, however, 1884 was really a year of turmoil. The City and Guilds Institute decided they were being left behind in this newfangled activity called engineering and decided to establish a chair there. He applied for it and was unsuccessful. And on this occasion, the successful candidate was William Cawthorne Unwin. As a fluid mechanicist, I'm sure we can all say, thank goodness, because just imagine coming in, starting up a new university. You had no apparatus, you had to order everything. Cawthorne Unwin was appointed dean, and it just submerged him for many years in organization. If Reynolds had been appointed, I don't think temperamentally he was suited to the post anyway, but you can forget about the 1895 paper. It just wouldn't have happened, I'm quite sure. Well, after that disappointment, Glasgow University, to which James Thompson had moved to join his brother, Lord Kelvin, Glasgow University conferred an honorary doctorate on Reynolds. Then the chair vacated by Clerk Maxwell at Cambridge became available. Reynolds again applied for that, but again it was unsuccessful. On that occasion, it was his former student, J.J. Thompson, who was appointed at the age of 27. And in the written article, I quote from a very generous letter of congratulations that Osborne Reynolds sent to J.J. Thompson on his success. However, you might say, why on earth was he so restless? Was his salary too low? I'm sure that wasn't the case. Reynolds didn't bother about those things. He just married, though. Maybe his wife wanted a more attractive urban environment than Manchester provided. Moving to the Kensington area of London, I'm sure, would have provided that, as equally would have moved to Cambridge. It wasn't either of those things, however. He was just thoroughly fed up and angry that the college was dragging his heels, had promised him laboratories, and still hadn't provided them. There's a record that he went to protest the Senate, and indeed, in the end, in 1887, he was provided with state-of-the-art labs. So now we come to that 1895 paper. It was presented orally to the Royal Society the year before, but then Reynolds had printed the paper and submitted it for review. It's, to my mind, an incredible paper. Not only does it introduce Reynolds decomposition, which of course contains the Reynolds equation containing the Reynolds stresses. This is not widely known. He actually introduced the concept of mass-weighted averaging, always including the density under his integral sign when working out mean quantities. It was just, I guess, the fact that he only studied water that this aspect of his paper hasn't attracted attention in the past. 60 years before the person that's usually credited with mass-weighted averaging. He also provided the first derivation of the turbulent kinetic energy equation and the mean kinetic energy equation, showing that the product of Reynolds stresses and mean velocity gradients basically represented a transfer from the mean motion to the turbulence. To give you an impression of how far advanced of its time this paper was, the corresponding scalar transport equation, the scalar energy, the theta squared equation, was only published by Stan Corsin 60 years later. Well, Reynolds actually used the turbulent kinetic energy equation to work out when it was that the energy generation, turbulence energy generation rate exceeded the viscous dissipation rate. Went off to referees, and Lord Rayleigh had now become the editor of Procroy Soc. He sent the paper to Sir George Gabriel Stokes. Stokes had by now got a typewriter with upper and lowercase letters, but didn't get his head round the paper too well. I find it very difficult to make out what the author's notions are. He tried to avoid providing a review with this sort of statement. So Rayleigh becomes rather impatient and decides he'd get the view of a younger professor who starts out quite imperiously, "I think the paper should be published as containing the views of its author on a subject which he has to a great extent created." But he then goes on with the phrase that you see there and follows it up with 3 pages of handwritten detailed criticism. And there was the person who carried out the review, and it turned out to be Horace Lamb, who was a professor at the same university. And if you think of the small size of the university at the time, it's rather like having a colleague in a single department be invited to review your own work today. Well, Osborne Reynolds' response was that he was very glad to know of the difficulties, and that because it provided him an opportunity to set things right. And he indeed provided a 5-page edition, which he actually sent and asked to be included, and you can actually see what the inclusion was, because it appears in the published paper entirely without comment, within parentheses, and with a date, the date before the date of Reynolds' letter, February the 18th, that appears in the paper itself. So it was accepted, and as they say, the rest is history. Let's briefly note Reynolds' final years in post. He also wrote the definitive paper on lubrication. There was a centenary celebration held on that in 1986. Having got his labs, he embarked on a large-scale experiment to determine the mechanical equivalent of heat. Reynolds was a great admirer of Joule, who had, well, of course, whose name is now remembered in the unit, but Reynolds' experiments came within 0.2% of what we regard as the definitive number. Lamb, in his obituary, noted that it's a model of scientific method, a classical determination, and this was repeated in a book by Gibson in 1956. He attempted a grand final paper, The Submechanics of the Universe, that was published as volume 3 of his collected works. And however, at the time, Horace Lamb wrote in his obituary of that paper, "Unfortunately, illness had begun gravely to impair his powers of expression, and the memoir as it stands is affected with omissions and discontinuities which make it unusually difficult to follow." That may be said to be a kind remark about the paper. Anyway, it seems that Osborne Reynolds in his 60s suffered from what today might be diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease, and in 1908 he moved to Watchet, a small but quite charming port in southwest of England. He actually lived above the port at a place, where did that? Okay. I forgot the order that they're coming in. Here we go. So here's a retirement portrait made of Osborne Reynolds, which is still in the department in Manchester today. It was painted by John Collier, who had the distinction of marrying both daughters of the president of the Royal Society. So Osborne Reynolds then spent his final years at Cinda Commons. The vicarage is to the left of the picture there. That still exists today. It is available as a bed and breakfast place. So if any of you fancy spending a night in, I don't know whether it'd be in Osborne Reynolds' bed, but perhaps in the bedroom he slept in, it's right down there. The 1911 census records that I printed a copy of shows that his wife Annie really had to complete the form and that there was a live-in nurse. Clearly it was a difficult few years. He died on February the 21st, buried in the church, and on behalf of the Royal Society and the University of Manchester, Horace Lamb attended the funeral. There is his elegant Art Nouveau gravestone, and we can see the inscription there, sacred to the memory of Osborne Reynolds, born August the 23rd, 1842, died February the 21st, 1912. One final issue I'd like to mention. The obituary in Nature hinted at something of an injustice. The obituary actually says, starts by saying, with the death of Osborne Reynolds, Great Britain has lost its greatest engineer scientist. And then at the end, after noting his various honours, his honorary degree, the Royal Medal of the Royal Society, and so on, it ends the obituary by saying, they were the only honours he ever received, implying clearly that something else should have been provided by the nation in gratitude, essentially that he should have been knighted. Well, indeed, George Stokes, Horace Lamb, and Edward Stanton were all knighted. These were contemporaries of Reynolds. They made, I believe, nothing like as great a contribution to fluid mechanics as Osborne Reynolds did. But of course, that isn't why you're knighted, your scientific prowess. Stokes was president of the Royal Society, and his progression to a knighthood was very clear. Stanton was a student of Reynolds. After graduating, he became, for a short time, professor at Bristol University, but then became head of the National Physical Laboratory, the engineering department there, for more than 30 years. Finally, Lamb was vice president of the Royal Society, was president of the London Mathematical Society at least once, but Lamb also had another attribute that unfortunately Osborne Reynolds lacked. It was longevity. He was 82 when he was knighted. And there was a third reason. The third reason was probably that the importance of his greatest work weren't recognized until long after their publication. And the truth of that is very clear. Well, in Nature's obituary, a very perceptive obituary in many ways, well in advance of his time, in many cases years elapsed before the practical bearing of his research were fully appreciated. Indeed, we can note the truth of that because this obituary makes no reference at all to any of the turbulent flow papers on which today's meeting is focused. Well, I'm sure Osborne Reynolds wouldn't mind. He enjoyed his teaching, he enjoyed the community of people around him, and I leave you then with this, this photograph, this final photograph of him at the university, as it by then become surrounded by students and staff. Thank you very much.
We could take one or two questions. Julian Hunter.
That was very good, Brian. I think, you know, when Maxwell died as the Cavendish professor, Rayleigh took on the job for a short time.
That's true.
And,
yes.
and the interesting connection between Rayleigh, which I didn't know, and Reynolds, of course, was Rayleigh only took the professorship because the hot candidate was my great-grandfather, who was nothing like her. And the reason why he applied for the job at Cambridge was because the corn prices fell, so he finally had to leave his farm in Essex and took the job at Cambridge. When the corn prices rose again, he could return back to his study in his farm in Essex, which still produces the milk we have in North London, of course. Yes. The other point, of course, is that Richardson also didn't get any award from the nation. Turbulence doesn't necessarily lead you in that direction, perhaps.
Yes, thank you. I had realised that Rayleigh took the chair briefly before, but because his tenure of the chair was so brief, I didn't mention it.
It's my turn now. You said that he derived the compressible equations with mass-weighted averaging. Did he use index notation, or did he derive it by looking on the full equations?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the beginning. Were you talking about...
You say that he was doing compressible fluid mechanics, compressible Navier-Stokes, and mass-weighted averaging. How did he do it? Did he actually use index notation, or did he go through the whole long path? No,
he included the density under his integral signs to show the methodology, but then later on he effectively said we're looking at uniform density flow.
There was a paper which really, I'm surprised you didn't mention that. His other very important paper, which I mentioned yesterday, was the paper in which Reynolds had a paper on mixing. And he looked at interfaces, which was actually much quoted by, I've forgotten his name now, the person who wrote a big annual reviews article on mixing and a book. But that's why Reynolds referred to the work of Howard on clouds. So I'm not sure which year that was in, but it was a, you know, there was a mixing paper which is actually very interesting in terms of interfaces and so on.
I can't give a precise date. I think it was in the late 1870s.
Maybe one more question. If not, thank you, Brian.
Not at all.